presentation today is John Minas and Andrew Maples' paper. John will begin the presentation on a comprehensive CGT for New Zealand, political suicide or tax policy saviour. You happy to hold it? Can we put it in now? Comes better. That's it. It's all right. Amazing. Okay.
See, it's been so long since people presented. Yeah.
See, Brett's gone and bought a new fancy one, and no one knows how to use it.
Okay, thanks. So this presentation is based on an article with Andrew Maples that was published in Australian Tax Forum last year, 36.1. So what our article considers is the introduction of a comprehensive CGT for New Zealand, and the part of our title, the term political suicide in our title, refers to a quote that's been in the New Zealand context for quite some time. And it goes along the lines that for a government that would seek to introduce a capital gains tax in New Zealand, it would be a form of political suicide that would relegate its opposition for several electoral cycles. So this motivated us to undertake some research looking at the experience of similar jurisdictions, Commonwealth countries, that were successful in introducing a comprehensive CGT. Was it in fact a form of political suicide for those governments? So in the New Zealand context, there's been numerous reviews that have considered and recommended a comprehensive CGT for New Zealand, starting with in 1967, the Taxation Review Committee, and most recently, the Tax Working Group, which released its final report in 2019, in which it recommended a comprehensive CGT with comparatively few exemptions. So at the moment, some capital gains are brought into assessment in New Zealand, but this is very much on an ad hoc basis. There's no comprehensive CGT. And in April 2019, the current New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, ruled out a CGT. So the statement was along the lines of, any time that she's a Prime Minister, there won't be a CGT. So it's a very definitive statement. It was made during a term of minority government, and it was a rather surprising statement. Notwithstanding there may have been some political impediments to introducing a CGT during that term of government, it was quite baffling that it was ruled out for a longer period of time. Of course, they're now in a majority government, I should say. That combined with the fact that New Zealand Labor had campaigned on the CGT issue in 2 consecutive previous election campaigns. So our research is by way of a comparative study of these 3 jurisdictions that we chose, United Kingdom, Canada and Australia. So they each introduced their CGTs in the years shown there, in the 60s, 70s and 80s, respectively. And some of the relevant questions that were explored were, what were the political conditions and economic conditions that allowed for the introduction of a CGT in each instance? And also, what were the political consequences for those governments that introduced the CGT? Okay, so a few comments on New Zealand before I get to UK, Canada, Australia, because ultimately the research is focused on New Zealand, and we're recommending that New Zealand should introduce a comprehensive CGT. So I think it's widely known that New Zealand is an outlier among OECD countries for the fact of not having a comprehensive CGT, but it's not the only country worldwide that lacks a CGT. So there are other examples, of course. And the quote that I mentioned earlier, one of the people that was a proponent of that quote was former New Zealand Prime Minister David Lange. And he went as far as to posit that the introduction of the CGT would have a result of a government losing the next 3 elections. So I don't know how that can be quantified or estimated, but that's what he said. And there was a former finance minister, Sir Michael Cullen, and he chaired the tax working group. So there was a time when he was finance minister, and the OECD had recommended at that time that New Zealand introduces a comprehensive CGT. And his response was that to introduce a CGT would be extreme, socially unacceptable, and economically unnecessary. But in chairing the TWG, his view on it seems to have changed significantly, because he did refer to vested interests being responsible for blocking the most recent attempt to introduce a CGT, and that as a result, New Zealand remains the only rich democracy lacking a broad-based CGT. So it's very, very much an outlier. Now, what we ultimately find, without killing the suspense, is that a CGT, the claims about a CGT amounting to political suicide for governments are not supported by the experience of these 3 countries, so UK, Canada and Australia. So they're all similar tax jurisdictions where, of course, the CGT was successfully introduced. Okay, so now to the jurisdictions that were the subject of our research, starting with the UK. So here we just have a timeline of the events related to the introduction of the CGT in the UK, and also some aspects of CGT and how it changed over time. So let me start with the 50s. So Royal Commission majority recommended against the introduction of CGT, but there was a minority report which supported it. And then in 1962, the UK income tax code was extended to include short-term capital gains on certain speculative deals. And it was a time when large amounts of tax revenue were being lost. And the government felt the need to respond to this. So in 1965, the Harold Wilson Labor government introduced the comprehensive CGT. So originally it was at a flat rate of 30%. So capital gains were taxed under a separate schedule when it was first introduced. And the CGT was part of the Wilson government's election policy platform. It was in fact the only tax related reform included in that election platform. Okay, so then go through some changes in the 80s. So 80-81, the UK introduced an annual exempt amount. It gets rid of some of the taxpayers with low levels of capital gains. And then they had another change, which was going from the flat rate of tax to taxing capital gains at marginal rates. And they introduced taper relief and withdrew it in 2008. Okay, so the important part, what was the political implications or effects of the Wilson government enacting the CGT? Well, not political suicide, because when it was elected, it had a parliamentary majority of 4 seats. And at the subsequent election, it increased that to a 98-seat majority. So another comment on the UK CGT is it's not a tax that has aroused much general opposition. And there are examples of other taxes where there's been a lot more negative reaction. So community charge is a prominent example. So the UK and Wilson wanted to reduce other taxes. The introduction of the CGT gave them an opportunity to do that in a way that did not appear to favour wealthy individuals. So then to Canada. So the background and summary is that there was a Royal Commission of Taxation established in 1962, and the resultant report of that Royal Commission, the Carter Report, was released in 1967. One of the recommendations of the Carter Report was the introduction of a comprehensive CGT. It said that they should be, capital gains should be fully taxable upon realisation. Then the Liberal Party in Canada, which is a left-leaning party, of course, changed from Pearson to Pierre Trudeau in April 68. And Trudeau won his first term of government in 68 with a 5% swing towards his party. So few more years till the CGT was introduced. In 69, the Liberal government released its white paper, proposals for tax reform, and then the CGT was enacted to commence in January 72. Okay, so what were the political consequences? Well, it was a difficult time economically. In the subsequent election in October 72, Trudeau's Liberal Party retained government, but it was with a 7% swing against it. So the Liberal Party was very much split on the CGT issue, and there was an organised campaign of opposition to the CGT from sections of the business community, farmers and other interest groups. The proposal garnered a lot of praise from leading academics though. And the motivation for Canada introducing the CGT was quite similar to the UK, equity concerns, and the Carter recommendations were not followed completely because from its enactment, the inclusion rate was 50%. So 50% of gains are included in taxable income, similar to what Australia operates now. And again, difficult to conclude that it was a form of political suicide. So in the second election following the introduction of CGT, the Trudeau government was re-elected with a 4% swing towards it. Okay, a couple of slides on Australia. So in Australia, we had CGT being recommended by the Asprey Committee in 75, again referring to equity reasons, as well as a misallocation of income that occurs when capital gains are not subject to tax. So it was the Labor Party that was advocating for a CGT from opposition. And in 79, the then leader, Bill Hayden, said that a CGT would be introduced if they were elected to governments. But a year later, in 1980, they had backed away from that commitment, announcing that they'd hold a major inquiry into wealth distribution. Nothing would happen until that inquiry was concluded. And there was a federal election in 1980. The Liberal Party, who was in government, ran a negative campaign referring to the Labor Party wanting to introduce a wealth tax. That negative campaign was thought to contribute to the ALP losing that election. And then we had different views from two prominent people in the ALP, Paul Keating and Bob Hawke. So in 1982, Paul Keating, who was then the ALP New South Wales State President, said that to introduce a CGT would be throwing a handful of marginal seats down the drain for a relatively small financial return. And he also said that to introduce a CGT would be relegating the ALP to the scrap heap for 3 more years. But at the 82 ALP National Conference, Bob Hawke argued that a CGT could be sold to the electorate. So he said something like, if we can't sell a CGT to the electorate, we shouldn't be in the business of politics. And then Hawke ALP government was elected in 1983, and there was also a federal election in 1984. During that 84 election campaign, Bob Hawke announced that there would be a national tax summit. And when the tax summit was held in 85, CGT was an option that was canvassed. And then obviously there were other points of discussion, FBT, consumption tax. So Australia enacted its CGT to commence in the 85-86 fiscal year. What were the electoral consequences? The subsequent election was in 87, and the ALP government was re-elected. It had a net gain of seats, so gained 4 seats in the House of Reps, but a swing against it of 0.9%. And what happened since then? The Liberal Party in 1990, when Peacock was the opposition leader, he said that he was going to do away with CGT, replace it with a speculative gains tax, and part of that would be no tax on assets held for more than 5 years. So nothing like that has ever happened. There's never been a party who has proposed to abolish CGT since then. In 1990 and 93, of course, Labor Party retained government, won those elections. So one thing that's relevant about the Australian experience is we've had someone who became treasurer, initially being quite opposed to CGT and then eventually overseeing introduction of it in government. So the political influence on things like this is probably unquestionable, but political suicide is probably a largely unfounded statement. And then, of course, the Howard government was elected in '96, didn't abolish CGT, but it introduced a discount which reduced the effects of some of the what the CGT is intended to do from a tax policy perspective. So conclusions, there's a lot more detail in the actual article about the 3 jurisdictions and everything that happens, a lot of things that happened. But our conclusion is that in each of the United Kingdom, Canada and Australia, the introduction of a CGT did not prove to be political suicide for those governments. So, of course, it's difficult to infer the exact effects of enacting a CGT. What did that do for the political fortunes of governments? But we do contend that the perceived political risks of introducing a CGT in New Zealand appear to be overstated. We go on to say that, notwithstanding that the Prime Minister of New Zealand has ruled out a CGT, it's a policy that should still be pursued. And we say that it's open to the Ardern government to include a CGT in its policy platform prior to a future federal election. And of course, New Zealand would and should be aware that when a policy like this is proposed, there will be strong, organised opposition campaigns to it. But that shouldn't prevent the pursuit of a worthwhile and overdue tax policy change. CGT is an integral part of a broad-based income tax, and it can be used to improve vertical and horizontal equity and provides for a more neutral tax system. Thank you.